All right, everyone, welcome back and welcome to our last video for week 3. I know there's a lot. We have so much to cover. This is such a broad topic, but I hope you're enjoying it as much as possible. So last lecture, we moved away from institutions and towards people. We talked about how conflict is experienced differently across societies and how gender shapes people's everyday experiences of things like violence, insecurity, survival, and agency. And the main idea that I wanted you to take from that is that people are not passive victims of conflict. They continue to build communities, support families, negotiate survival, maintain relationships, and create opportunities for peace, often long before formal peace agreements are ever signed. So that leads us to today's question. If peace building has already been taking place within communities, why has formal peace building so often overlooked the people doing that work, and how does gender reshape peace building? So in our week 10 lecture, we spent a lot of time talking about conflict transformation. We talked about Galtung and positive peace, which argued that sustainable peace often involves more than simply ending direct violence, and it requires transforming the structural and cultural conditions that allow violence to persist. We also looked at Lederach's approach to transformation, and that peace isn't simply negotiated by political leaders, but through relationships, communities, institutions, civil societies, families, religious organizations, schools, local leaders, and so on. So peace is a long-term social process rather than just kind of a single political event. So gender scholars will typically agree with Lederach's broader understanding of peace building, but adding the question, well, who's actually doing the work of building peace? Traditionally, peace building has often been understood through these highly visible activities that we've talked about. And those are important, but they're not the entire picture. So a lot of feminist scholars are arguing that peace building also occurs in far less visible ways. So within communities, within households, within local organizations, within informal networks, and very often, again, long before peace agreements have been signed. So this idea is particularly emphasized by one of the readings, Annette Eidler. She argues that if we focus only on governments, armed groups, and formal negotiations, we will overlook many of the people who are already reducing violence and rebuilding relationships. So she encourages us to shift our attention away from the centers of political power and towards what she calls the margins, as we've talked about. By the margins, she's referring more to the everyday lives of people who rarely appear in these diplomatic negotiations, but whose actions often shape whether communities survive conflict. Now, within that, peace-building scholar Sanam Anderlini, one of her books is on the screen here, argues that for decades, peace-building existed in kind of two parallel worlds. So in one, we had women who were deeply involved in sustaining communities by organizing things like humanitarian assistance, maintaining schools, supporting displaced families, and so on. And in the other, they were largely absent from formal peace negotiations and international security institutions. So understanding this disconnect became one of the major motivations behind what we've talked about a little bit, the women, peace, and security agenda. So women will often reduce tensions, preserve relationships, and create the social foundations upon which later peace-building efforts can build. And this is why Eidler argues that peace building shouldn't be understood only as something that begins after conflict ends, but something that exists within conflict itself. So peace and conflict overlap. Communities don't simply wait for politicians to negotiate peace. They frequently start building it themselves. So this idea connects really closely with the concept of local ownership that we've already talked about. We know that sustainable peace can't only be designed or imposed from outside. Local ownership emphasizes that communities themselves possess knowledge, relationships, and capacities that are essential for long-term peace. Now, within that, case studies from places like Colombia, Nepal, the Philippines, Sierra Leone, and Uganda demonstrate that locally led implementation often produces stronger community ownership because the local actors understand the specific social, political, and cultural dynamics shaping conflict within their own communities. Now, sustainable peace ultimately depends upon local people shaping their own futures. That doesn't mean that local communities always agree. We shouldn't romanticize local actors, as we've talked about, but because these communities contain their own inequalities, conflicts, and power struggles. But feminist scholars consistently argue that durable peace becomes much more likely when local voices, especially those of women, youth, Indigenous people, and other historically marginalized groups, are meaningfully involved in building and shaping peace building efforts. So that connects directly what we talked about in the last lecture, because conflict is experienced differently because people's identities, responsibilities, and opportunities differ. Now that applies to peace building. People also contribute to peace differently. Some negotiate, some mediate, some organize the humanitarian assistance, some rebuild schools, some support reconciliation, some advocate for justice, and some maintain relationships that prevent violence from escalating further. So peace building isn't just one thing, it's a lot of things. And recognizing those many forms of peace building changes how we understand peace itself. So this broader understanding of peace building eventually raised some important questions within the international community. If women in local communities are consistently playing central roles in sustaining peace, then why are they so often absent from formal negotiations and peace processes and international peace building efforts? And that question eventually gave rise to one of the most significant developments in contemporary peace and conflict security policy, which is the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. So, by the late 1990s, there was this kind of increasingly uncomfortable contradiction that was beginning to be really difficult to ignore. We've seen that women were already playing significant roles in conflict, and they were significantly affected by conflict. But they weren't being recognized when formal negotiations began. They were frequently absent from the negotiating table. So peace agreements were often negotiated entirely by those political elites, military leaders, and governments, and the people already doing a lot of the work of sustaining communities frequently had little influence over the formal agreements that would shape their futures. So then it kind of led to this question, well, if women are already building peace, why are they so often excluded from formal peace building? At the same time, we were dealing with the devastating consequences of conflicts in places like Bosnia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, and elsewhere. And the wars in Bosnia and Rwanda were particularly influential because they demonstrated to the international community that conflict-related sexual violence wasn't simply an unfortunate byproduct of war. Increasingly, it came to be understood as a deliberate strategy of warfare, ethnic cleansing, and political domination. So these conflicts changed international conversations a bit about women, conflict, and security. Now, they not only highlighted the widespread use of conflict-related sexual violence, but also the limited participation of women within international peace and security institutions. And increasingly, women's organizations, researchers, humanitarian organizations, and civil society groups argued that peace building itself needed to change. The issue wasn't just about protecting women in conflict, it was recognizing women as political actors whose participation was essential for sustainable peace. And this growing movement eventually culminated in this development. So, in October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1325. So, I don't want us to think about 1325 as another UN document. It's more useful to understand it as a turning point. For the first time, the UN Security Council recognized that women weren't simply affected by conflict. It reframed women as active participants in conflict prevention, peace negotiations, peacekeeping, humanitarian responses, and post-conflict recovery. So it shifted international policy from asking how do we protect women towards asking how do women shape peace and security. And this represented a shift in viewing women as people capable of being affected by conflict, but also recognizing them as actors capable of preventing conflict, negotiating peace, rebuilding societies, and shaping international security itself. So the resolution is often summarized through 4 interconnected pillars. The first is participation. Who's making decisions? This is about increasing women's participation at every level of decision-making related to conflict prevention, peace negotiations, peacekeeping, governance, and post-conflict reconstruction. You can see some of this here on the screen with more details. Second is protection. So who remains vulnerable in conflict? Protecting women and girls from gender-based violence, particularly conflict-related sexual violence, while ensuring that their rights are respected throughout conflict. The next piece is prevention. So how do we stop violence before it begins? This is about addressing the underlying causes of conflict and preventing violence through gender-sensitive approaches to peace and conflict. And then we have relief and recovery. So what kind of society are we trying to rebuild after conflict? This is about ensuring that humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, recovery, and post-conflict development responds to the different needs and experiences of women and girls. Now, these three pillars are very deeply connected. Participation without protection is insufficient. Protection without meaningful participation leaves existing power structures unchanged. Recovery without prevention risks reproducing the same inequalities that contributed to violence in the first place. So basically, Resolution 1325 was never intended to simply be about women. It was an attempt to kind of rethink international peace and security itself. Now, since its adoption, the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda has expanded considerably. So the UN Security Council has adopted a series of additional resolutions addressing issues such as conflict-related sexual violence, implementation, accountability, and post-conflict recovery. Resolution 1820 in 2008 was about explicitly recognizing conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of war and as a matter of international peace and security rather than just a humanitarian concern. Resolution 1888 in 2009 was about strengthening the international mechanisms for responding to conflict-related sexual violence and emphasized accountability for perpetrators. Together, these resolutions showed that the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda wasn't just a static thing. It evolved as researchers, practitioners, and affected communities continued to identify new gaps in international peace and security, from conflict-related sexual violence to implementation and accountability, even youth participation and long-term recovery. We also have more recent resolutions. So, for example, Resolution 2250, 2419, and 2535. These have been expanding this thinking further by recognizing things like young people's agency and the participation in peace building through the Youth, Peace, and Security Agenda. And you can look more into that. But another development happened outside of the Security Council, and this was in 2013. This was the committee overseeing the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And this was particularly related to General Recommendation number 30, which connected women's human rights with conflict prevention, conflict, and post-conflict reconstruction. But generally, it's a hugely transformative document. As you can see on the screen, you can read various reports on it, but it's a treaty on the human rights of women and girls. And it goes over what discrimination against women is and how countries and individuals can begin to end gender discrimination. This is not a separate document to Women, Peace, and Security. From international human rights law, the General Recommendation 30 reinforced the argument that women's rights remain relevant both before, during, and after armed conflict. So really important document, very revolutionary for the rights of women. Next with that, we have national action plans. So countries around the world have developed national action plans to guide implementation. On the screen there, you have Canada's National Action Plan for 2023 to 2029. More than 100 countries have adopted national action plans to implement women, peace, and security agendas. It is important to acknowledge that there's significant variation in funding, implementation, monitoring, and political commitment. So adopting policy is only the first step. But international organizations have also adopted gender-sensitive peace-building strategies. Women's organizations have gained greater visibility within international policy discussions, but implementation has been a little bit uneven. As mentioned too, according to UN Women, women represented only 7% of negotiators, 14% of mediators, and 17% of signatories in peace processes during 2024. Those numbers show us something really important. The challenge today isn't necessarily about convincing most international organizations that women's participation matters. it's about ensuring that the participation actually happens. So researchers are increasingly arguing that participation too isn't enough. So what does meaningful participation actually look like? It might seem like the solution is relatively straightforward. If women have historically been excluded from peacebuilding, then just include more women. Yes, increasing participation is an important first step, but participation alone isn't really enough. What does meaningful participation look like? So if we have a peace negotiation where one woman sits at a table with 20 military and political leaders, technically women are represented, but does that necessarily mean that women's perspectives shape the negotiation? Does it mean that different issues will be discussed? Does it mean that decisions are made differently? Not necessarily. So this is a really huge debate within this kind of literature, is the difference between representation and meaningful participation. Representation is about who's in the room, but participation is about who has influence. So whose voices are actually heard, who shapes the agenda, whose priorities become reflected within the final agreement. And this is particularly important because women are not a single unified group. We've discussed this throughout the week. Women experience conflict differently depending on various different things. Increasing the number of women participating doesn't automatically ensure that marginalized perspectives become included. So we want to increase the emphasis on meaningful participation rather than numeric representation alone. And studies have reached the same conclusion. The global study that I've talked about earlier looked at hundreds of peace processes and found that women's participation is most effective when women are involved throughout the entire process rather than consulted only at the final stages. And this again argued that local organizations, women's organizations, frequently receive the least funding despite often doing the greatest amount of peace building work at the community level. And this disconnect between the political commitments and financial investments has become one of the major implementation challenges identified throughout the literature. So the report also argued that women's participation, as we know, contributes most effectively when women are there for things from agenda setting to negotiation to implementation, reconstruction, constitutional reform, and long-term recovery. So that participation needs to be seen not just as a single event, but as an ongoing process. Representation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So that brings us back to empowerment. We discussed Kabir's framework for resource, agency, and empowerment. Here is where we can start to see where it becomes useful. So peace building doesn't simply require inviting people into decision-making spaces. We've talked about that. It's about ensuring that in those processes, they have resources, authority, education, security, institutional support, and political opportunities to participate meaningfully. Otherwise, the participation risks becoming just symbolic rather than transformative. So that's why we talked about resources, agency, and achievements. You can look at more of that through this diagram. So that brings us then to the idea of justice. Post-conflict reconstruction is about a lot more than just rebuilding roads, schools, and government buildings. It's also about rebuilding relationships, institutions, and public trust. We've talked about transitional justice processes like truth commissions, even criminal tribunals, reparations, institutional reform, and memorialization. But this always raises a really important question about whose experiences are being recognized, who tells the story of conflict, whose suffering is acknowledged, whose voices help to shape the historical record. And gender scholars argue that these questions matter because justice isn't just about punishing perpetrators, it's also about recognizing harms that may have been invisible before. So in a lot of post-conflict justice processes, they've primarily been focused on battlefield violence, but given less attention to things like conflict-related sexual violence, displacement, unpaid caregiving, or the long-term social and economic harms that have been experienced within communities. So a gendered lens asks us what happens when other forms of violence are not systematically measured. So if we're not measuring domestic violence, psychological trauma, reproductive health, unpaid caregiving, economic insecurity, or everyday fear in conflict data stats, then they can disappear from policy discussions as well. So the way we measure conflict influences how we understand conflict. We've talked about this. What gets counted often becomes what matters politically. And that's why we also have to know that data is never completely neutral. Decisions about what to measure and what not to measure shape both research and policy priorities. So a gendered lens can also help us to understand justice itself and what it requires. With that, I want to make a distinction here between equality and equity. I know these can kind of be like jumpy words, but equality is basically about treating everybody the same. Everything's evenly distributed regardless of differences. Equity is more about recognizing that people start from different positions and might require different forms of support in order to participate equally. So in the diagram here, you can see that in inequality, there's unequal access to opportunities. Equality, it's evenly distributed. Equity, it's customized to identify and address that inequality. So two people are participating in a peace negotiation. One has education, political experience, financial support, resources, security, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and institutional support. The other's been displaced, has caregiving responsibilities, limited financial resources, and ongoing security concerns. Treating both those people identically doesn't necessarily create equal opportunities for participation. In equity, we want to ask what barriers need to be removed so that meaningful participation can be possible, because both those perspectives are absolutely necessary. So this connects back to everything that we've talked about throughout the course: structural violence, power, identity, agency, conflict transformation. All those things remind us that sustainable peace depends not only on ending violence, but also creating conditions in which people can meaningfully participate in shaping their own futures. Now, we can look at this and go, okay, well, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has solved so many of our problems, but unfortunately, we're learning different things. 25 years after Resolution 1325, researchers are increasingly starting to ask whether it's been implemented in ways that produce meaningful transformation. It's been an incredibly influential framework within international peace and security, and it's gone well beyond its original focus, but as we're examining things like masculinities, LGBTQIA experiences, technologies, displacement, intersectionality, youth participation, climate change, and decolonizing peacebuilding, we're not just asking where women fit within existing institutions. We're now asking how peacebuilding itself can become more inclusive, locally grounded, and transformative. We know that dozens of countries have adopted national action plans. International organizations have routinely incorporated gender into peacebuilding programming. Women's participation is now widely recognized as an important component of sustainable peace and representative politics. Compared to where we were at in 2000, we have huge progress. The 2010 report on the UN Secretary General on Women, Peace, and Security has reached a similar conclusion. Awareness of the agenda over the past 20 years has increased dramatically across governments and international organizations, but there's still issues with meaningful implementation. The first decade of Resolution 1325 shifted the conversation to creating policy, to asking now whether that policy is actually changing people's lives. So the first debate within this is, has the Women, Peace, and Security agenda transformed peace building, or is it just simply changing the language? So here's a reading that you can look at if you're interested. This is kind of the debate around counting women. We've talked about this a little bit earlier. Counting how many women attend a peace negotiation, how many women serve in parliament, how many women join a peacekeeping mission, how many women participate in reconstruction projects. Those numbers do matter. Representation, as we know, is important, but it tells us very little about power. A peace process might include women, but leave existing power structures almost entirely unchanged. Women may be present, but without having meaningful influence over decisions. So participation has to be more than symbolic. It has to be transformative. So we need to not just ask, are women included, but what difference does that participation actually make? The second is implementation. We talked about this a little bit. The Resolution 1325 established an ambitious international framework. So implementation has been uneven. A lot of the national action plans are underfunded. Women's organizations frequently receive only a small proportion of international peacebuilding funding, despite carrying out a substantial amount of the work at the community level. Political commitments have not always translated into meaningful institutional change. So researchers are increasingly concerned about distinguishing between policy commitments and implementation. And the challenge is less about writing new resolutions and more about finding ways that the existing commitments can actually be realized. Here we have an example of a report produced about the Canadian National Action Plan and implementation. Next is localization. We've talked about this. This is a great book to take a look at. International peacebuilding sometimes tends to export standardized models of gender equality without necessarily recognizing local knowledge, local priorities, and local ownership. We've often prioritized external expertise over local knowledge. So instead of asking how international organizations can implement WPS, we want to look at how local communities themselves can interpret, adapt, and shape the agenda within their own political, social, and cultural context. So sustainable peace is much more likely when communities are defining peace building alongside international partners than just receiving externally designed programs. Now, again, we don't want to abandon universal human rights. We don't want to romanticize local communities, but we do want to recognize that sustainable peace is often most likely when those communities help shape the peace-building priorities. Peace-building is not something that international organizations can simply deliver. It's something that we have to actively build. And then we have the essentialism critique. So we've repeatedly emphasized that women are not a single homogenous group, nor are men. But some early interpretations of the women, peace, and security agenda occasionally implied that women were naturally more peaceful than men. Contemporary scholarship strongly rejects that assumption. As we discussed, women have been combatants, political leaders, peace builders, activists, intelligence officers, negotiators, mediators, members of armed organizations. Men have experienced victimization, displacement, trauma, forced recruitment, and so on. Gender does not determine behavior. It does shape opportunities, expectations, identities, and relationships of power. More recent scholarship has emphasized that gender should never be treated, though, as synonymous with women. Research is increasingly examining masculinities and asking how expectations around protection, military service, authority, emotional restraint, and citizenship also shape conflict and peace building. So understanding gender also requires examining the relationships between the different masculinities and femininities rather than just looking at women alone. Now, with that, another author, Florence Waller Carr, also reminds us to think critically about the language of protection itself. International policy sometimes constructs what she calls the vulnerable and violated other woman, a narrative that can unintentionally reinforce this idea of unequal power relationships by portraying women primarily as people needing rescue rather than as political actors with agency. So even well-intentioned policies should be examined critically, and we need to look at how we describe people and how that influences how we imagine solutions. Next is gendered silences. Some experiences continue to receive limited attention despite our expanding understanding of conflict. So unpaid caregiving, psychological trauma, reproductive health, long-term economic insecurity, and everyday forms of violence still remain underrepresented within both policy discussions and conflict data sets. Again, those silences matter because what researchers choose to study often influences what policymakers choose to address. So the author of this article, Selimovic, argues that these silences are not simply accidental omissions. Some are produced because the institutions fail to ask certain questions. Others come up because experiences such as domestic violence, caregiving, those things remain politically uncomfortable or socially stigmatized. So understanding these silences is about examining not only what we know about conflict, but also how knowledge about conflict is produced. Now, structural transformation. This idea should sound familiar. We have another article here. Basically, we've talked about structural transformation, negative and positive peace. We've talked about conflict transformation. Sustainable peace requires changing the structures, relationships, and institutions that reproduce violence. Gender scholars make a very similar argument. Including women within existing institutions is important, but if the institutions continue to reproduce unequal relationships of power, then lasting transformation remains incomplete. So in this article, it's argued that one of the greatest costs of ignoring gender in conflict analysis begins to appear gender neutral. Well, actually, it's reflecting existing power structures. So simply ending armed violence doesn't necessarily produce peace for women if patriarchal institutions, unequal power relationships, and everyday violence remains unchanged. So post-conflict societies might simultaneously experience peace and continued gender insecurity. So gender scholarship isn't just how do we include women, but how do we transform the structures that have historically produced exclusion? How do we make those systems produce more just, inclusive, and sustainable forms of peace? And that brings us full circle. At the beginning of this week, we talked about how gender isn't simply a topic within conflict studies. It's a lens. And now we can start to see why. That lens has encouraged scholars to rethink violence, conflict, security, peace building, justice, and transformation itself. So, we've explored gender, power, violence, agency, peace building, and transformation. But what does a gendered lens ultimately contribute to conflict studies? I really hope that you have a solid answer for that after watching all of these. We started this kind of next phase by talking about what kind of peace we're trying to build. And then we talked about how gender shapes our understanding of conflict, violence, security, lived experiences, agency, and peace building. And hopefully one idea has remained constant throughout, and that's conflict is almost always more complex than it first appears. Every theoretical lens allows us to see certain dimensions of conflict more clearly, and this week we looked at one of the most influential contemporary perspectives within conflict studies. Not because it replaces earlier theories, but because it expands it. It allows us to ask different questions, to notice different things, and to recognize different forms of violence. And ultimately, it helps us to imagine a more inclusive approach to peace, not just within conflict, but within our own lives. So traditional conflict analysis is more about why did conflict happen, who negotiated it, who suffered. A gendered lens is, well, how did gendered power make conflict possible? Whose experiences remained invisible? Who is excluded from peace building? What kind of peace are we trying to build? So what I really want you to walk away with is a gendered lens doesn't replace conflict analysis. It substantially deepens it. Now with that, a couple of things. First, you should now have received an email about completing your teaching evaluations. Absolutely, please do that. I don't get to review them until after the course is finished, but they're incredibly helpful for me to know kind of where I'm at, how things are going pedagogically, what you're liking, what you're not liking, all of those things in future course development. It also helps the university understand where things might be going right or things might be going wrong. So please fill those out. It would be so great, and I love opportunities for feedback. Now, I also want to talk a little bit briefly about the discussion assignment because it's our next one. So this one is, how does gender shape experiences of conflict? Provide one example. How does this challenge assumptions about conflict? And why does it matter for analysis? So I don't want you to describe what happened to men or women during conflict. I want you to apply the analytical lens that we've been developing throughout this week. Think back to where we started. Gender isn't just another topic in conflict studies, it's a way to understand conflict. So As you think of your example and are working on your example, move beyond simply describing. Ask yourself, well, how did gender shape this person or group's experience of conflict? What assumptions about conflict does this example challenge? What became visible through a gender lens that might otherwise have been overlooked? How does this change the way we understand conflict itself? There's no single correct example. You might talk about conflict-related sexual violence in a certain case. You might talk about militarized masculinities in a certain case. You might look at displacement, refugees, women combatants, everyday peace, Indigenous experiences, LGBTQIA plus experiences, caregiving, or local peace building initiatives, or more. It's not the topic that you choose. It's about demonstrating how a gendered lens changes your analysis of the conflict. As always, connect your discussion concepts to the week's lectures and readings wherever appropriate, and make sure that you're responding to a peer as well. So I really look forward to reading your discussion posts. I hope that you've enjoyed this very dense, long series of lectures. And I'm excited to see how you're going to apply a gendered lens to understanding conflict. I will see you next week for our final course of the semester. Have a good week.